Republican strategist Serena Shaw joins us now. Thanks for being with us. I do want to start with one of those Trump supporters that we saw in John King's piece, Chris Mudd, right? Two things. He doesn't buy into Trump's style, the insults and everything else. Okay, fine. But he also says that Harris is getting an easy ride, that she's not being challenged enough by the media and elsewhere. Fair point?
I do think that's a bit of a fair point. Although I will say, I find it all right that she talks to reporters in her pool quite a bit and that she's out there present at rallies, talking to the public in wherever she chooses to fly to that day. It was just Pittsburgh yesterday, and now she's in Chicago for day one of the DNC. I do think she has been public, but I understand that sentiment that her not having sat down for that proper one-on-one, look another journalist in the eye and talk to them does leave a lot of folks feeling like she's not willing to face the music and face tough questions. It's not a view that is uncommon. And we do see it held coast to coast with even independents that could be swinged.
Yeah, and when we get to those key voters that the former president really needs to try and tap into in order to win this election. This race is close, as we said. How do you suggest that Trump and the Republican Party now move forward with that, especially in a week when the Democrats have the media spotlight on them?
Well, I think what one of the voters said actually really stuck with me, and there were two S's. The word she used first, the phrase she used first was sidestepping. And then the second phrase she used was status quo. Those could be two really strong words in the toolbox of verbiage that the Trump campaign could pull from this week. They essentially should be talking about how Kamala Harris is a continuation of Biden's 4 years. After all, she has been his VP. But this campaign, the Harris Walz campaign, has tried in earnest, particularly over the past week and a half, to say, hey, take a chance on us, give us a fresh look, hit reset with us. I think that's been particularly good for many communities, but it's not been the best strategy overall. And that leaves an entryway for the Trump campaign, again, to speak to those undecided voters that may hold those feelings as the voter who thinks of Kamala Harris as representing the status quo, as not having earned this nomination, so to speak, as not having come out of a primary in doing so as well.
Do you have confidence that Trump will pivot as he needs to issues like the economy and the way you just spoke of them?
I have zero confidence that he's able to exhibit any degree of message discipline that will speak intelligibly. And when I use the word intelligibly, I mean Trump has to speak in his own way on kitchen table issues. That's what worked really well for him in 2016. It didn't work well in 2020, but I submit to you that it was a different set of circumstances he was under in 2020. He was the incumbent. He represented the status quo at a time where it felt like the world was completely blowing up in front of us. We all were being locked at home. And I think he was booted out of office at the end of the day for his poor handling of the pandemic. But now, when we're 4 years past it all, it seems, we are having amnesia almost. And Trump could, again, take this opportunity to speak with data points, to speak to some of that frustration with the undecided voters, particularly suburban women who are college educated, have young children. It seems like he's not able to do that, especially in the past few weeks since the Republican National Convention. Nothing tells me he's going to be able to do that well, even after Labor Day, when he'll really need to do that.
And the other startling thing one of the Trump voters said there, which is an issue that continues to pop up, was the fact that even if Kamala Harris wins, he does not believe that it will be a fair win. How much are both campaigns truly getting prepared for this in the day after the vote?
Well, I would say I think the Trump campaign is getting really organized in a way that we could not have even known about in 2020. They've had 4 years to have these election activists, people who were contemporaries of a woman like Cleta Mitchell, who was very prominent in Trump's election interference challenges. When we're talking about the states, when we're talking about the recounts, there were 7 states, if I'm not mistaken, where there were fake electors. And there were also a number of challenges in those states. At the end of the day, he did get recounts both in Georgia, two of them, and in Wisconsin. This time, expect that these same people are ready to do so much more, because what they've started to show us is that they want to question the legitimacy of Kamala Harris as being the nominee. That's not something that can be done. This is how parties work. This is totally normal. After this convention is over on Thursday night, I think the campaign really begins. But the worry I do have is the aftermath of is that time between election day and the day of the certification in Congress. What will those people try to do in the courts? I think they're far more ready than the Harris Walz campaign is, and they haven't been able to reveal to us what their tactics are. So when we do find out what they are, the lawyers and the experts are really going to have to be ready to fight back against what Trump and his people have ready to do in the courts.
Yeah, it really will become contentious no matter how close the election is. Rena Shaw, again, thanks so much for outlining the counter programming for us for the week to come. Appreciate it.